The first letter came on a Tuesday. I remember because I just finished staining the new cedar fence I built that weekend. It wasn't some towering monstrosity, just a clean, 6-foot privacy fence around my backyard. Standard, legal, permitted by the county. But according to the HOA, I'd violated aesthetic conformity standards. I stood on my porch, letter in hand, watching the self-appointed neighborhood warden herself, Tamara Aldridge, march toward me in her pastel cardigan like she owned the zip code. "Darren Richter," she shouted, not even bothering with a greeting. "You can't just put up a structure like that without approval." I raised an eyebrow. "I checked your bylaws. Section 4 explicitly says fences under 6 feet don't require pre-approval." She scoffed like I'd insulted her cat. "Those guidelines are outdated. We're updating the rules, and as acting president, I can enforce temporary measures." "Temporary dictatorship, you mean?" I muttered. That didn't go over well. Her jaw clenched so hard I thought she'd crack a molar. She handed me a second letter, this one a fine $250, due in 10 days. I laughed. "You're fining me for something that was legal when I did it." Tamara poked a manicured nail at my chest. "If you don't pay, we'll place a lien on your property." I stepped back. "Try it. I'll see you in court." What she didn't know was that I'd already dealt with an HOA nightmare once before when I lived in Nevada. I wasn't about to let this power-hungry suburban queen play games with my property again. The next day, I showed up to the HOA meeting. I wasn't subtle, I brought a binder. Every photo, permit, date-stamped email, and a printed copy of the bylaws. Tamara and her entourage, 3 other middle-aged women who looked like they were auditioning for a reality show called Desperate for Control, looked smug as I sat down. Tamara tapped her gavel. "We are here to discuss Mr. Richter's violation," I interrupted. "With all due respect, I'd like to submit evidence that the so-called violation never happened." She sneered. "This isn't a trial, Darren." "No, but it's going to be," I said, placing a copy of a small claims court filing in front of her. The room went quiet. I stood. "You want to fine me for following the rules? Fine. I'll see you in front of a judge. And while I'm at it, I'll subpoena your emails." She paled. "Because here's the thing. I'd already spoken to my neighbor across the street, Greg, a retired lawyer, and he told me that Tamara had been pushing through rule changes without board votes or homeowner input for months. I wasn't the first target, just the first to push back, and I wasn't stopping. Greg met me in my garage that evening, carrying a worn leather satchel and a bottle of rye. He sat both on the workbench and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "She's not just bluffing," he said. "Tamara's been issuing fines without board approval for a while." I looked up the association's filings with the county. The last official board meeting they logged was over a year ago. I wiped my hands and turned to face him. "So she's running the HOA solo. She's pretending the board still exists on paper. But the others? 2 of them moved out and 1 resigned. No elections, no replacements. That's a violation of your association's governing documents and state law." I opened my laptop and pulled up the email thread I'd started with the HOA. "Think that's enough to build a case?" He poured 2 glasses. "If this were small claims, maybe. But we're looking at misrepresentation, fraudulent fines, and misuse of funds if she's collecting penalties and using them without a functioning board." He paused to sip. "You need to involve the city, maybe even the county attorney." I called in a favor the next morning. An old friend from college, now working in the city zoning office, agreed to pull the HOA's filings and send me over anything public. What she found was better than I expected. Not only were the board positions technically vacant, but Tamara had submitted changes to the association's bylaws using forged signatures. She'd fabricated approval from non-existent board members. I forwarded everything to Greg. He called within 5 minutes. She committed document fraud. "That's a felony. Think the police will care? They will when you hand them notarized proof and a dozen affidavits from homeowners who never voted on any changes." We spent the next week gathering those. Greg drafted the statements and I went door to door. At first, some neighbors were hesitant. But once I explained Tamara had been issuing fines based on fake rules and that she'd pocketed some of the payments directly through a Venmo account registered to her name, they started talking. One couple, the Kleins, had paid over $1,000 in landscaping violations after Tamara claimed their rose bushes violated sightline safety. Another family got a lien notice for parking their pickup truck in their own driveway. No one had seen an actual board member other than Tamara in over a year. By Friday, I had 17 signed affidavits, screenshots of the Venmo transactions, the altered bylaws, and a notarized statement from the former treasurer confirming he'd resigned 15 months ago. That Monday, I filed a formal complaint with the city's Department of Consumer Protection and delivered a packet to the district attorney's office. Greg helped me prepare a civil suit alleging fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. Tamara didn't know any of this yet. The court date for my original fence case came the following Thursday. She arrived in a tailored blazer, dragging along one of her cronies, a woman named Carol who looked like she hadn't read a legal document in her life. I brought Greg. We sat at opposite tables in the small courtroom. The judge, a former Navy officer with a no-nonsense expression, called the case. Tamara launched into a speech about preserving property values and architectural harmony. She waved photos of my fence like they were evidence of a crime scene. When it was my turn, I handed the judge a copy of the original bylaws, highlighted the section proving the fence was allowed, and then added, "Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence related to the conduct of the HOA and its acting president." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Proceed." I laid out the forged bylaws, the fake board members, the financial records, and the affidavits all neatly tabbed in a binder. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The facts did the yelling for me. Tamara's expression shifted as the judge flipped through the pages. She tried to interrupt, but he held up a hand. "Miss Aldridge, did you submit these documents under penalty of perjury?" She cleared her throat. "I was acting in the best interest of the community." "That's not an answer." I had implicit authority from whom?" he asked. "Two of these board members moved out over 8 months ago. One says he resigned." "Who gave you the authority to alter binding governance documents?" she stammered. "The board was inactive." I had to make decisions. The judge closed the binder and looked at her like she just confessed to robbing a bank with a water gun. This court finds that the Homeowners Association, under the guidance of Miss Tamara Aldridge, has not only failed to follow its own governing documents, but has actively engaged in fraudulent activity against its homeowners. He stood. "I am referring this case to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate injunction against the current HOA administration. All fines, liens, and enforcement actions issued in the past 12 months are hereby voided." Tamara's mouth hung open. "As for this specific case," he added, "Mr. Richter is in full compliance with the documented bylaws. No fine shall be levied. And given the conduct of the HOA, I am ordering a third-party audit of their finances." Greg leaned over and whispered, "That's the legal equivalent of a tactical nuke." But it wasn't over. The next day, county officials showed up at the HOA office, a converted room in Tamara's basement, as it turned out with a warrant. They hauled out boxes of files and a desktop computer. Tamara was placed under investigation for wire fraud, document tampering, and embezzlement. The city also issued a cease and desist order against the HOA, suspending all operations until a new board could be elected via a verified vote. In the meantime, the community rallied. Those who had been fined, harassed, or threatened over minor infractions came forward with their stories. The Kleins, the Morales family, even Carol, who confessed she'd been pressured into backing Tamara's decisions under threat of being fined herself. We held a neighborhood meeting at the local library. Greg explained the legal process for re-establishing a legitimate board. I volunteered to serve on the interim committee until elections could be held. And for the first time in months, people laughed instead of whispered. They shared lemonade and stories, some bitter, some ridiculous, like the guy who got a violation notice for having too many wind chimes. By the end of the evening, one thing was clear. The community wasn't afraid anymore, and Tamara. She was last seen leaving her house in a hurry, a moving crew loading boxes into a rental truck. No one waved. No one offered to help. Even her loyal dog walking companion crossed the street to avoid her. The HOA board was gone and the fence still standing, just like me. The morning after Tamara's abrupt departure, a city contractor arrived at the neighborhood entrance with a cherry picker and a drill. The HOA's tacky wooden sign, painted with gold cursive and flanked by 2 dead azaleas, was unscrewed and lowered into the back of a flatbed truck. He didn't say much, just pointed to a clipboard with an official seal and drove off. Nobody complained. That afternoon, a temporary notice was posted near the community mailbox kiosk. It outlined the scheduling of emergency elections, supervised by a neutral receiver appointed by the court. Until the vote, all HOA functions were suspended. No fines, no enforcement, no newsletters with passive-aggressive reminders about grass length. Greg and I met with the court-appointed receiver, a no-nonsense woman named Deborah Langston. She used to audit nonprofit boards for the state. Her handshake could crush granite. "I'm not here to make friends," she said, flipping through a manila folder. "I'm here to clean up a mess." She spent the next 3 days in the back room of the local library, going line by line through the HOA's finances. I brought her coffee on the second day. She didn't look up from her calculator. "You're short over $47,000, she said, tapping keys. Most of it siphoned through third-party vendors that don't exist, invoices for landscaping that was never done, repairs to a community clubhouse that doesn't exist, and then there's this." She slid over a photocopy of a check made out to a company called Aldridge Community Services. "Tamara's maiden name," I muttered. "Bingo." Deborah leaned back. She set up a shell company and paid herself, monthly. This goes back over a year. A week later, the police returned, this time with detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit. They collected the rest of the documents and confirmed what we already knew. Tamara hadn't just violated HOA rules, she'd committed felony fraud, tax evasion, and theft. The district attorney filed formal charges, and a warrant for her arrest was issued. She was picked up 2 counties over, living in a short-term rental under a fake name. It made the local news. The headline read, "HOA president charged in $47K fraud scheme, neighborhood breathes sigh of relief." The following week, election ballots were mailed out to the residents, each one with a unique barcode to prevent tampering. For the first time in years, people actually wanted to be involved. Candidates held open queue and sessions at the library. One guy even brought donuts. I didn't run. I'd done what I needed to do. But I endorsed a neighbor named Val, an ICU nurse with no tolerance for nonsense and an instinct for fairness stronger than most judges. She won by a landslide. By that point, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow. The constant tension that had hovered like humidity had vanished. People started chatting on sidewalks again. Kids drew chalk murals on their driveways and no one threatened to issue a violation over it. Then came the restitution hearings. Under state law, a victim impact review was required because Tamara had defrauded over 20 households. Greg and I were asked to testify. The courtroom was packed, not with lawyers or press but with neighbors. Some had been fined. Others were just there for support. Even Carol came, this time sitting away from Tamara's side, hands folded like she was waiting for a confession. Judge Wallace presided again. He didn't waste time. "Miss Aldridge," he said, peering over his glasses, "you've been charged with 23 counts of fraud, 5 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of tax evasion, and 1 count of obstruction. How do you plead?" Tamara looked exhausted. Her hair was frizzed, her blazer too tight. "Guilty," the judge nodded. You understand that restitution is mandatory. The court will determine the exact amount based on the audit and testimony. Greg stood to speak first. Your Honor, this was not a misunderstanding, he said. This was a calculated abuse of power. Miss Aldridge didn't just mismanage funds, she targeted people who trusted her. She weaponized the HOA to extract money from her neighbors. That's not negligence, that's predatory. Then it was my turn. When I built that fence, I thought I was just adding privacy to my yard, I said. I didn't realize I'd be uncovering a fraud ring, but I'm glad I did. Because now my neighbors don't have to live scared of their own board, and maybe next time someone tries to pull something like this, they'll think twice. Tamara didn't look at me, not once. The judge ordered her to repay every dollar, plus interest. That included refunding all fines, covering the cost of the audit, and paying for the legal fees of every homeowner who had been forced to fight a bogus claim. He sentenced her to 3 years of probation and 6 months in county detention, with mandatory financial ethics classes. But something bigger happened after that. The State Attorney General's office launched a review of HOA oversight laws. Turns out, our case wasn't unique. It just happened to be the first one someone fought hard enough to expose. 2 months later, new legislation was introduced requiring mandatory audits for all HOAs with over 50 homes, public election disclosures, and a cap on discretionary fines. The bill passed. Val called me the night the news broke. You realize you just helped change state law, she asked. I was in the garage fixing the lock on my tool cabinet. I chuckled quietly. I just wanted to keep my fence. She paused. You might have given the rest of us something better. A week later, the new board installed a bulletin board by the mailbox kiosk with community announcements, upcoming events, and most importantly contact info for every member of the HOA. Transparent. Accountable. Exactly as it should have been from the start, people stopped asking if they could plant flowers or repaint their shutters. They just did it. And if someone had a question, they asked their neighbor instead of filing a complaint. One Saturday morning, I stood at the end of my driveway, sipping coffee, watching a group of kids set up a lemonade stand. One of them asked if they could use my hose to fill their cooler. Sure, I said, just stay out of the flower bed. They laughed and ran off. Across the street, Greg was mowing his lawn. He caught my eye and gave a thumbs up. Behind me, the fence still stood tall, unstained now, weathered just enough to blend in with the landscape. No signs. No warnings, just a fence and not a single fine in sight. The new HOA board didn't just rebuild the association, they dismantled the moldy foundation it had been rotting on and started fresh. Val, now president, ran meetings in the open-air gazebo behind the community park. No gavel, no theatrics. Just folding chairs, notepads, and residents who finally felt like their voices weren't being filtered through a control freak's personal agenda. By mid-spring, the legal dust had mostly settled. The restitution payments had begun trickling in through the county collections office, and residents were starting to see small checks in the mail. They weren't massive, but they were symbolic. Each one came with a letter that included a printed court seal and the phrase, "Reimbursement for invalidated HOA enforcement." It was the kind of thing you framed out of principle. One Saturday morning, Val called and asked if I could help her sort through a stack of old HOA records that had just been returned by the state's forensic auditors. She'd reserved a room at the library and already had boxes stacked like they were prepping for a yard sale. These were in Tamara's possession when they served the warrant, she said, flipping open a dusty binder. Turns out she kept more than just financial records. Look at this. Inside was a yellowing notebook, handwritten entries, each one dated with names, address numbers, and weirdly specific notes. Next to Greg's name, it read, "Too nosy. Avoid confrontation unless necessary." Beside mine, "Fence will be ideal first strike, test how much fight he has." Val's hand froze over the page. She had a whole strategy. It wasn't just fines and fabricated votes. She tracked which neighbors were likely to comply, which ones were isolated, and who had previously complained to the management company before it was dissolved. There were even notes on household income estimates based on Zillow records and visible car models in driveways. It was profiling. Cold, methodical targeting. She used this to plan who she could pressure, I said. She didn't just want control. She wanted to break the ones who wouldn't give it to her. Val picked up her phone and called Deborah Langston, the court-appointed receiver, now overseeing the HOA's legal compliance temporarily. Deborah didn't wait long before calling in the sheriff again. This time, they brought an investigator from the district's white-collar crime unit. The detective, a wiry man with a soft voice and a legal pad, took photos of every page in the notebook. He didn't look surprised, just tired. She wasn't just embezzling, he said. This is coercion by systemic abuse of administrative authority. We've seen this in corporations, but rarely in HOAs. 2 weeks later, Tamara's charges were amended. The new indictment included a count of targeted civic intimidation, a rarely used statute involving the misuse of organizational power to harass or suppress private individuals in a residential zone. It was a felony. Her attorney tried to argue it was just poor record keeping. The judge wasn't buying it. The trial was scheduled for early summer. Unlike the previous hearings, this time it wasn't just our neighborhood watching. Several regional papers had picked up the story. HOA corruption wasn't new, but a case involving fabricated enforcement systems, forged governance, and psychological targeting. That was different. The courtroom was packed. I sat 3 rows back next to Carol, who had since joined the new compliance committee. She whispered, "If I ever so much as see another pastel clipboard, I'm going to set it on fire." The prosecution led with the notebook. They called a behavioral expert who testified that the pattern of targeting based on perceived vulnerability qualified as a form of stalking by proxy using the HOA's enforcement infrastructure as a weapon. Then came the financial expert, who showed how Tamara routed payments through a layered system of bank transfers and shell invoices. Her own private account had received deposits days after certain residents paid their fines. The worst moment came when they played a recording one homeowner had secretly made after Tamara threatened to report his teenage son's car as abandoned if he didn't fix his mailbox post. Her voice, firm, flat, calculated, left the room silent. The defense didn't have much. They tried to argue mental health, stress, even neighborhood expectations. But the jury didn't buy it. After 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution to every affected homeowner, with the court mandating that her personal assets, a second property in the next county, a leased SUV, and several investment accounts be liquidated to begin repayment. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked me what I thought of the verdict. "She didn't just mess with rules," I said. "She messed with people. She used fear like a tool, and we took it back." After that, the community changed in more ways than I expected. People started walking in the evenings again, not just to get steps in, but to talk. A new resident moved in across from Greg, a single mom named Renee with 2 kids and a dog that barked at everything. Instead of complaints, neighbors dropped off treats and left a card welcoming them to the street. The new board passed a resolution to limit enforcement actions to documented safety issues, only no more fines for bad vibes or aesthetics. They also created a rotating community advisory panel, so no one person could dominate policy again. The HOA's name was even changed. No more Heritage Grove Residential Committee. Now it was simply the Grove Neighborhood Association. Simple. Transparent. Greg stepped down from the advisory committee after 6 months. When I asked why, he said, "Feels good to fight the fire." But sometimes, it's better to hand off the hose before you turn into the thing you beat. I started building a small greenhouse in my backyard, Nothing fancy, just a curved aluminum frame and polycarbonate panels. No permits needed. No oversight. Just me, a screwdriver, and a few afternoons of peace. One evening, Val stopped by. She brought a thermos of coffee and 2 folding chairs. We sat by the fence, still standing, still unbothered, and listened to the cicadas. "I'm glad you fought back," she said. "I don't think I would have had the guts if you hadn't pushed first." "I didn't know I had it in me either," I replied. She looked over at the greenhouse frame. "You planting tomatoes?" "Maybe," I said. "Or jalapenos, depends how spicy I'm feeling." She laughed and stood. "Just don't let them creep into anyone else's yard. We might have to fine you." I raised an eyebrow. "You want a court date that bad?" She waved and walked off, still chuckling. The stars came out overhead, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not to bylaws, not to paper tyrants, and definitely not to anyone with a clipboard and a superiority complex. Just neighbors, just home.